Tony Evers, State Superintendent of Public Instruction, just submitted a new fair funding plan for K-12 schools. It was given to lawmakers and Governor Scott Walker. He hopes it's part of the 2015-2017 state budget the governor will be recommending early next year. Superintendent Evers, welcome back to WisconsinEye to talk about the new version of fair funding.
It's great to be here.
This is version 3.0 fair funding.
3.0.
3.0.
It's like some kind of digital thing. 3.0. Yes.
Well, I want to do some bullet points.
Yes.
But first, overall question: you call it fair funding, which implies that it's not a fair funding system right now. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely not. It's broken in a whole number of ways. One is it's very disequalizing. It's not equalizing at all. There's a lot of poor districts in the state that
poor and rural districts penalized.
Yeah, penalized. And also, you know, when this funding formula was deemed okay by the Supreme Court, it had some conditions. One is about taking care of students with disabilities, English language learners, kids in poverty. All those are kind of criteria that were kind of laid out by the Supreme Court. None of those have kept pace over the years. So not only is it's a distribution of general aid, but it's also the categorical aids. You
got me so intrigued. You and I remember that that Supreme Court ruling. I think it was 4-3.
Yes.
And it said that the state has a duty and an obligation to provide.
Yes, but I have to correct you. It was unanimous.
It was unanimous. Yeah, Thanks for the correction.
It's a different Supreme Court now, as you know.
Well, what would happen if the current formula?
I'm sure they would see the wisdom of the previous court.
I see. Okay. Well, moving on.
Yeah.
You're trying to change the. Well, you're trying to make progress.
Yes.
And so let's go through some, point by point. First, you're recommending $613 million more in general categorical aid to public schools. This would come from the general fund, sir?
Yes. Yeah. We don't have our own transportation fund in public education where we have a lockbox. We compete with other entities in state government for it. Yes. It would be coming out of the general fund.
And what drives the 613 number?
Well, it's about a 2-point-something% the first year and 4-point-something the second year. And basically what we feel is that it moves the state back in the direction, not anywhere near close, but back in the direction of a 2/3 commitment on the state's part. We feel it's realistic. That's the bottom line. It seems like a big number, but we've seen big numbers from transportation. We've seen big numbers from Medicaid. And we believe this is a realistic number.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about transportation first. Yesterday, Secretary Gottlieb was in here, and they want $574 million from the same general fund.
Yes.
And the Department of Health Services wants $760 million to continue MA coverage.
Certainly.
Is yours equally? You want $613 million? Is that just as critical to the future of Wisconsin as those other two programs?
Oh, absolutely. And I love roads. I love driving on good roads. Medicaid is absolutely important. But to dismiss ours because it's just too much, I think is not a rational approach. Our kids are our future. We have to make sure they're highly educated. We have 650,000 kids in our system. We want them to be college and career ready, and it's not going to happen without adequate resources. Simple as that. I think we're equally as important and deserve the attention that the transportation and Medicaid deserve.
Well, we're talking about other uses of general fund dollars. You sit on the Board of Regents. The Regents has said we're willing to accept a 2-year tuition freeze, but we need $95 million to help support the system.
Right.
So that's also competing for the $613 million that you'd like to go to public schools, correct?
Absolutely. And there's no difference this time around than last forever. I mean, it's basically competing priorities. We hope that the legislature sees in its wisdom that public education is a value added to not only the quality of life in Wisconsin, but also to make sure we have a robust economy. We need to we keep hearing from our business partners, and they're right. We need to have high quality people to work in our workforce and to have a good economy. I agree, but it's not going to happen for free.
Well, one of your programs would do just that, would provide additional money to help our K-12 students get some of those skills for their work, for the workplace, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. We continue to support dual enrollment opportunities and other opportunities to have students have as many options as possible coming out of high school, whether it's career, whether it's going to technical college, whether it's going to higher education.
I have a follow-up question, but let's go to point 2 on the bullet. We'll come back to it. Divert $897.4 million in property tax credits to school aids. Can I just ask, wouldn't this raise our property taxes, fellow homeowner?
No. No, it doesn't, because, I mean, it's an obtuse way it's done now, and I know it's a political reason for doing it, but the fact of the matter is that tax levy credit is counted as school aid, and it's counted as school aid because school districts have to artificially raise their tax levy in order to capture it from the municipalities. I'm saying send it directly to the schools. Let's not have a middle person in this equation. So no, what we're suggesting in the total package is no property tax increase, but moving the tax levy credit out of the system into general aid will not do anything other than to make it more clear where that money's supposed to be.
With this infusion of general fund cash, then you'd be able to say it would not trigger a property tax increase for K-12 schools?
Correct, overall, across the state. Certainly there's going to be pockets here and there. We just had 30 referenda passed in the state that will impact local taxpayers, but just looking across the state at 424 school districts, it would be a zero.
So 30 referendums passed, how many went down? You know?
It's about 12 to 15, something like that. It's a pretty good number.
What does that tell you, 2 to 1?
Yeah, it tells me that it's a message for our legislators that people care about their schools and are willing to pony up. The problem is there's the 12 or 15 that didn't, and over a period of time, if we keep seeing the kind of stagnation in investments in public schools, we're going to have haves and have-nots. I mean, it's simple as that, and it's going to further divide our state, which we don't need.
So you include, just go back to it because it's important, do you include language in fair funding that would preclude any property tax increase by the 424 school districts?
Right. There's no language in there that would do that because we can't, because things happen at the local level, like referenda, that would cause an increase. So what we do is we put enough money in the general aid and set the revenue limit at 200 in the first year, 204 in the second year. The money from the state would help backfill that amount and keep things at zero.
And how did you know? That's number 3 on our bullet list. Increase revenue limits by 200 per pupil in 2015-2016 and 204 in 2016-2017. Time for a history lesson. How much did they go up in the current biennium by each year?
It was, I want to say it was 150, something like 150. It was less than 200.
Over 2 years?
Yes, it was 150 one year and then an additional 50 the second year. That was actually kind of portrayed as a categorical aid. It's beyond my thinking how that happened, but this is going to be a small increase. But you know, the time before it was $550 decrease, and so
that was in the 2011-13 budget.
Yes, and so we're kind of getting past
550 per pupil.
Yeah,
decrease.
Okay,
thank you.
And that was, you know, as we've talked about and the state has talked about, that was covered by essentially the employees of the school districts taking cuts in their benefits.
That was the Act 10.
Yeah, Act 10 business.
Shift.
And so that covered part of it, didn't cover all of it, depending on who you argue that piece with. But you can only do that so many times. That's a well you can't drill every time. We can't be forcing people out of the profession because they can't afford to stay in it. So I'm arguing that we do need an increase, and it's the $200 and $204 is that's around cost of living. That's 2%, and that's
about 2%. That's what I read in your materials.
Yeah, and that's what districts would, you know, that's cost of living. That's what they would be. They'd be stopped from spending more unless they have a referendum to do it.
So school districts would have the ability to spend an additional $200 in the first year, $204 in the second year per pupil. Correct. Would that be covered by the first item on our list, the $613 million in the general fund?
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's how it comes out to zero property tax increase, generally speaking.
Okay, let's talk about your fair funding would guarantee $3,000 per pupil in state aid. Now, I was intrigued. 60 school districts, 60 out of what's the number?
424.
424.
Yeah.
Get little or no state aid?
No, little or no general state aid, which is the biggest pot.
Yeah, that's the biggest pot. Categoricals.
Yeah,
is the
and
smaller pot.
it's all about arcane notion that property values equal how much money you have in your pocket. And that's one of the things we're trying to fix with this fair funding formula. And this is one of the ways to do it. We guarantee $3,000 a kid if you're a wealthy yet income poor school district up north or not. Most of the districts that would benefit from this are in northern Wisconsin. It's a rural issue. When
I talked last year to the superintendent at Alma, which is where I think one of the speakers, Task Force on Rural Schools, he says second recreational homes are nicer than the ones full-time homeowners have in the district. So that's an example of a property-rich district, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. There are districts in the state where the highest income person living there is some teacher at the top of the salary schedule making $35,000 a year. That's wealthy, and allegedly. So yes, but the property around, in the area is high because of recreational use, and they get little or no state aid. That's absurd. That's just absurd. We have to change that. I know people say, oh, we can't do any changes this year or next year because of X, Y, or Z. I've been doing this. This is my third budget, and I've heard that same argument now going on 3 budgets, and I think there's no better time to do it, frankly.
When was this current school aid formula? It dates from when?
Oh.
70s? 80s?
I would say before then. I mean, we've been kind of fighting around this issue for 36 years that I've been in public education. It's changed.
And then it gets tweaked because
there's
tweaked
a little bit.
aids and everything.
Yes. It's so complex. That in itself is irrational. But yeah, it's been around a long time. Let's put it that way. And it's, as I said before, in 2000 or 2001, by unanimous vote, the Supreme Court said this is constitutional. It's fair if X, Y, and Z happen, and my argument is X, Y, and Z aren't happening. It's not taking into account all sorts of factors that they considered very important.
Okay, one other element, back to our list. Yeah. You'd build a poverty factor into the general aid formula. Explain that to me, because when I go through the supporting documents, there's a reference to a 30%. Now, what's a 30%? So you'd get a basic allotment of state aid plus 30% if?
Yeah. Essentially, it would count a student of poverty 1.3. Everybody else will be 1.0 if you're, and what that does is it drives funding to our more impoverished districts, but it also, because it becomes a factor in the funding formula, it takes away, it helps us move away from property values being the judge, because now we have 2 factors in there. If I had my magic wand, but we don't have the data to use it, but we'd go away from property values, period, and just use income, because as you may know, on our income tax forms at the state level, we have to identify what school district we live in, but that data isn't, solid. I mean, it's not audited and so on. So we'd have trouble doing that. So what I hope to do is kind of move us away from that, and this is one way to do that.
Well, one way to do it, but talk about the larger issue. As when I read DPI press releases, the number of districts that are increasingly offering fair and reduced meals keeps going up. That's one measure of poverty, right?
Absolutely. That's a measure we use, and it's moving exponentially.
We're talking under federal poverty guidelines. Excuse me for interrupting.
Right. Yes.
So what's the number now statewide?
It's around 46, 47%, something like that. It's approaching 50, and it will be 50 if the trajectory continues, and there's no reason to believe it won't. Certainly it's impacted by the economy, but even our economy necessarily isn't growing at the point where the jobs that are being filled are highly paid jobs. So it's not necessarily an unemployment issue. It's how much people take home in their pocket. And that continues to be stagnant in the state. And that's reflected in the school free and reduced price lunches.
How many Wisconsin school districts are offering just free meals to all their students?
The federal government allowed that to happen in a recent guidelines that they laid out. I want to say it's a handful. It's mostly urban areas, and it makes sense. It's actually a money saver, because the collection of that data and administering the program for school districts that have 80% free and reduced lunch and 100%, they're saving money administering it by doing 100%. And so it's a savings all the way around. We support it. There's just one little nuance in that we use that figure for determining all sorts of other things too.
Yes.
And so we have to make sure that we continue to have a reasonable accuracy with that number.
Just a follow-up question on this bullet point. A child who comes from a household that is below the poverty level, how is she or he disadvantaged in the classroom?
Okay.
Tony?
And I just have to tell you, free and reduced rates on lunches is higher than the actual poverty level.
Yes.
It's a percentage higher. How are they impacted? Well, they basically, their parents don't have the resources to provide books and other technology, making sure they're in summer going to camp, all the things that middle-class America and middle-class Wisconsin take for granted. And in addition, kids that come from poverty many times come from homes that are under distress. People are working 2 or 3 jobs to make things work in their household. That impacts their kids. That impacts kids in a huge way. So we just can't deny it. It's added an extra cost to it.
Is the biggest way that poverty shows up our achievement gap?
Yes. That's one of them, but as we've talked before,
Wisconsin has the worst achievement gap?
We have the worst achievement gap as it relates to race.
Yes.
Income is an issue. As we've talked before, race is a huge issue in the state, and that African Americans and the gap between whites and African American achievement is huge. It's something we're working hard on.
And you just completed a task force on that, and the recommendations are out.
Right.
And are you hopeful that we can finally begin making strides closing that achievement gap?
Absolutely. We've begun the discussion to move it forward, and it's, I think, a real hopeful discussion.
Okay, back to our list.
Yeah.
Under your proposal, fair funding, third version, 95% of school districts would get more aid, 5% would be held harmless.
Yes. Anytime you.
How far out? First year, second year, forever? What?
Well, after this next time, we would be up to, if everybody starts from the same place, the next biennium, we wouldn't have to do a hold harmless.
Okay.
Yeah.
How big is the gap in average per pupil spending now in Wisconsin? It's some districts spending 12 and others spend, well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have the specific answer. It's not as, I know people talk about it in terms of thousands and thousands. I would say it's probably $3,000 to $4,000 between the lowest spending and the highest spending.
Per pupil.
Per pupil, yeah.
Okay.
It might even be somewhat less than that. But the fact of the matter is we need to make it fair for everybody and making sure that we don't have, and this is especially a rural issue. I think we're in the throes of something in our rural Wisconsin where we would soon become a state of haves and have-nots, and we have to value what rural Wisconsin's about. Even during the cold weather and snow that we're having, we have to value that. And this funding proposal that we have helps negate that.
Okay. Next item just intrigues me. You're no fan of choice. Fair?
And that's fair.
But your fair funding plan would continue it in the city of Milwaukee.
Right.
And the city of Racine, and you would leave in place the 1,000 student cap statewide, correct?
Right.
So are you putting on your political realism hat and just saying, given the GOP makeup of the Capitol, it's going to stay around there?
We by law we have to budget for that. I mean, it's in our budget, so no question about it. But the issue around the choice program now is that it's the same thing. There's a limited resources, and if people are going to prioritize transportation, if they're going to prioritize Medicaid, and if they're going to prioritize expanding vouchers, I can tell you there isn't going to be a penny left. We have to figure out what we value in the state of Wisconsin. That's my concern. The fight around vouchers to me is not an issue anymore of whether they work or they don't work. Clearly, the majority feels they work, and that's that. We do have an obligation, I believe, to argue about the issue of finances, and if expansion's on the table, that's money that the regular public schools will not get.
Okay. So you've heard the governor and the GOP legislator, Speaker Voss, and Senate Majority Leader Fitzgerald say they want to pop. They don't want that 1,000 student limit.
Mm-hmm.
as part of the next budget. Your reaction to that?
I think the issue has to be, we have to be treated fairly in the regular public schools. If we're expanding, that's money that's not going to the public schools. So I can't support expansion. I understand the tea leaves. You know, I drink tea. I get it. But the fact of the matter is, we have competing priorities, and we have to make sure that the public schools are at the table.
You've been watching Choice for a long time. Are you surprised how it's morphed from Representative Williams, who just passed away, 1989 to 90, and the expansion?
No, I'm not surprised, and I'm not saying this to belittle public schools, regular public schools, or to cast any aspersions on choice schools. But there is a national movement around this, and it's a well-funded movement, and they do a great job of making their point, and they've done a great job of electing people that are supportive of their point of view. I think we have great opportunities for choice in the public school systems, whether it's charters, whether it's choice within, you know, like Milwaukee Public Schools. The kids going there have as much opportunity for choices, different choices, as anybody in the state of Wisconsin, maybe even in the country. So I get the value of choice. I just don't want to see the 860,000 kids of our state disadvantaged as a result of a program that is much smaller and is part of the private and parochial school system. It's not that I get the tea leaves, but I do need to continue to fight for adequate funding.
As a tea drinker and reader of tea leaves, did you read the November 4 election election results as a mandate to continue to expand choice?
No. I saw that argument by Mr. Jensen, and I just don't buy it. I follow races all across the state, and even the governor's race wasn't about education. Period. Very little. And I didn't see those local races having choice and vouchers discussed at any level. Certainly the money that went into the races helped people that supported choice, but I didn't see that as a mandate for choice. I saw it as a mandate for Republicans to continue to control government in the state of Wisconsin.
Well, just continuing on that before we get to the next bullet point, the November 4 elections that reelected Governor Walker and Republicans in both houses in leadership. Was that bad for our K-12 system, Mr. Superintendent?
I believe we can work with the governor and the Republican majority to have adequate funding for our schools. I don't believe any one of those folks that were elected this last time, or the ones that were not up for election, hate public schools. I don't believe that at all. However, I'm planning to make an argument that we need to have our resources be adequately funded.
Okay. Let's look at the last bullet, please. Yeah. $2.3 million. Now, you've got a bunch of new programs, but I just pulled out this one.
That's an important one.
$2.3 million in new 100 per student aid for bilingual, bicultural.
Yes. Our number of Hispanic children and Latino children in the state of Wisconsin is exploding, and other kids that English is not their first language. This is one of the areas that the Supreme Court was very clear on. We have to make sure that students that English is not their first language gets an adequate education and are able to succeed in our economy and in our state. Right now, and I don't know the exact number, it's in the single digits. We reimburse districts about 8%. That is not adequate. We're asking for a large amount. It's in the grand scheme of things, it's not big. That's why I think we really need to get behind this issue. Also, students with disabilities, that funding hasn't been increased for several millennia, and they're important kids. They're important to our economy and our state. We need to adequately have resources.
Let's talk about rural schools. Yeah. What would the fair funding program do for rural schools? And one PS on this, in the Assembly Republican agenda, one of their goals is state-funded digital learning program. Is that part of fair funding? Do you know what they're referring to in that?
No, I haven't seen the proposal. I believe there's an interest on some people's parts, and I think even and the administration to make sure that our rural areas of the state have adequate bandwidth for the infrastructure to really grow our economy, but also make sure our schools. That's what I believe they're talking about, but I haven't seen that proposal.
Well, go back to fair funding and how it would help rural schools. $8.4 million for sparsity aid.
Yes.
That would help 130 districts?
Absolutely.
Are those rural districts?
Those are all rural districts.
Okay.
Absolutely. And that's fully funding it. We've had a significant number of districts that are eligible for that, and we believe that going forward, that's a real key part of our plan. The sparsity funding, actually, the fair funding proposal itself, the general aid distribution at $3,000 per kid, that helps rural Wisconsin. We can't have haves and have-nots in the state, and this budget will help prevent that from happening.
I want to ask you about something else in the Assembly Republican agenda. Through the statutes, we will encourage school districts to keep a majority of their operating expenditures in the classroom. I haven't seen the details, neither have you. Do you know what they're alluding to, sir, in their goal?
No, although that's not a necessary. I haven't seen a proposal specifically. I've seen similar proposals over time on that, and where they'll say instructional costs need to be 60% or 80%, some percentage.
Right.
And I get that. But what happens when you're up north and you have to transport kids, hour and a half each way to get home? Which
you and I have heard testimony.
Yeah, and that's expensive. So
including in the Merrill district.
How are we going to squeeze that lemon? And I believe. I believe the state has a significant role in public education, but there are areas where I think local school boards can figure it out. This is one of them.
That's one of them. This summer, you and I haven't talked. I think the last time we talked to you was in May. Since then, Governor Walker asked that Wisconsin withdraw from Common Core standards. Since we haven't talked, since he made that plea, how has that developed, and your reaction?
My reaction is school districts across the state are implementing it as we sit here today, and have been implementing it for many of them for the last 4 years, and will continue to implement them. That decision, even though some people may not quite understand it, is a decision that's made locally in the state of Wisconsin. I offered the Common Core as a good way forward in the state of Wisconsin. School districts decide that. And so in order for that to stop, first of all, it would be chaotic. But second of all, in order for that to be stopped, essentially decisions would have to be made to make sure that school districts no longer have that authority. And I don't think that's a good way forward to say, well, school districts, in this case, we're going to tell you exactly what should be taught in our schools. I think that's done locally, and I think our local schools are doing a great job implementing it with great success. I'm sure there's going to be all sorts of discussion around this going forward, but I believe school districts will continue to stand behind it.
Is Common Core the biggest fight you anticipate having in the next budget debate, sir?
Oh, not the biggest. I mean, if
funding
is absolutely, having adequate resources is really, really important. Of course, we're going to be talking about accountability systems, and
that's my next subject.
And Common Core, but our schools need adequate resources, and there's going to be all sorts of debate around transportation, Medicaid, expanding vouchers, our system.
Let's talk about accountability. Have you seen the draft of what the Journal-Sentinel reported as Paul Farrow's bill?
Yes.
So I'm going to quote from the Journal-Sentinel. Would create a accountability board at DPI to determine the data to be collected from all public charter and private voucher schools and included on the report cards. In last sentence, it would also determine what sanctions or rewards should be given to schools based on how they perform. Have you seen that draft?
I've seen the draft, and it's drafty. There's some things that I don't quite understand, and some things that seem contradictory. I'm really interested in having a discussion around this issue. Senator Fitzgerald has indicated that he's willing, I saw it in the paper, willing to have a conversation around it with me. We need to move this forward instead of having to continue to revisit it every 6 months, which is in nobody's interest. But frankly, it's going to be around like who's making these decisions and how they're going to be made and all that. And I think we'd probably get someplace, but we need to have a discussion with folks.
If Governor Walker runs for president, does that make him more of an ally to Wisconsin's K-12 schools as he tries to lay a national campaign theme. Your thoughts?
I'm not sure how that's going to work out. I mean, I've never considered him an enemy of our public schools, but I'm not sure. I think schooling and public schools is really important. It's my top priority. But, as we saw in a rather robust governor's race recently, that education was hardly ever talked about, maybe 5 minutes. And I think that will be even less so at the presidential level. I mean, it's very, very seldom. It may be forming around, whether it's states' rights or federal rights and all that kind of stuff. But it's hard for me to answer that one. I think it's the most important issue, but that's me. That's my job.
And then finally, when you announced the fair funding plan, you saw the statement from Speaker Voss and Co-Chair of Finance Representative Nygren. And I'm just going to read a couple words. Education has been and will be a top priority of the Wisconsin Assembly Republicans. Last session, Republicans continued to show their support for public schools by investing nearly $300 million more and close to $1 billion in tax relief for Wisconsin families and employers. Your reaction?
Well, we're talking apples and oranges there. The taxpayer relief isn't necessarily something that's providing resources to schools. So they're coming from where they're coming from. I'm coming from where I'm coming from, and I'm looking forward to having the conversation with them. And
then final question, what's at stake in the next budget in terms of funding our K-12 schools?
Well, it's really an interesting dichotomy. I visit classrooms all the time, and things in the classroom always, they're great. Kids are great. They're engaged. We're still achieving at a high level, but we're really on the cusp of some stuff here. I'm fearful for rural Wisconsin in particular, where Act 10, gotta love it for those who wanted it, but the fact of the matter is, it's created a Wild West as it relates to compensating teachers, and it's not going to be long before we'll have frankly, a teacher drain brain out of northern Wisconsin, where they'll get more pay elsewhere. They'll get, instead of having 6 preps, if you're in Cameron, you're going to go to Chippewa Falls and have 1 prep. I think we're really on a danger point as it relates to haves and have-nots, and that certainly plays out in rural schools and suburban schools.
Just a very quick follow-up. As rural schools, especially in northern Wisconsin, lose their best teachers, do you look for those teachers to stay in Wisconsin for higher paying jobs, or do you look for them to jump to other states?
Well, I know they're jumping to other states. I hear about it in the Minnesota region. But they go to larger school districts. They can still live in rural Wisconsin and have the benefits of that, drive 30 miles down the road to Chippewa Falls and get $15,000 more, 1 prep instead of 6. And not that we're going to ever create an equal playing field in that. That's just a fact. But in order for us to make sure that our best and brightest teachers in northern Wisconsin are adequately compensated and respected, I think that's really critical. I mean, people talk about the importance of having a high-quality teacher in every classroom. I agree, and it's absolutely critical. But if the field is so, as I said, it's a Wild West, and that's what's going to happen.
Very good. Superintendent Tony Evers, thanks for talking about Fair Funding version 3.0.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.